Companies have been struggling to embrace employee well-being in the workplace for a long time now. Historically, well-being initiatives were considered as not so important, and they were not a priority for many employers. However, things are changing. As these challenging times are having a significant impact on employees' well-being, this is a wake-up call for many employers to consider investing in well-being initiatives. In today's episode, we'll discuss corporate culture, employee well-being programs, psychology in the workplace, amongst other topics with our special guest, Jarrett Green. Jarrett Green is a workplace well-being, corporate culture, and peak performance consultant. After 12 years as a corporate litigator, Jarrett has been living his passion as he consults to and leads workshops at top corporations across the globe, such as US Bank, NBC Universal, Verizon, Tesla Motors, Salesforce, and more. Having a degree in psychology with emphasis in neuroscience, organizational and positive psychology, Jarrett has been helping corporations create happier and healthier work environments with increased equity and inclusion, reduced harassment and bias, improved communication and relationships, enhanced engagement and resiliency, optimized performance and productivity, and greater overall success.
Welcome to our podcast, Coast to Coast. We are here on a mission to empower you with cutting-edge knowledge of business, marketing, and digital communications. We want to inspire you with tips to cultivate your skills and strategies to scale up your business. With proven methods that work, you have just landed on your transformative journey with Jacob Dermelkonian.
Hello, Jarrett. A poor culture can hamper even the most well thought out of employee well-being strategies. So how can you create a workplace well-being culture which gives employees the opportunity to grow both professionally and personally? And what are some of the strategies you follow to deliver a good return on investment? Because that's not something that companies can actually monetize.
A very good question. It's hard to monetize, it's hard to measure. But first and foremost, the company leaders need to understand the basic science and all of the monetized data in the industry, any aspect of corporate America, international corporations, World Health Organization. There is a huge amount of data that just conclusively shows that when employees are healthier, happier, and feel cared for by their employer, virtually every aspect of expense for the company goes down and profit margins go up. Obviously, absenteeism significantly drops. Presenteeism, where people are physically present but completely distracted and costing companies millions or billions, depending on the size of the company, goes down. Workers' compensation claims go down. Disability claims go down. Internal conflict goes down. There's data that shows that the average mid-level and up manager spends about 1 out of 5 days total, when you aggregate the total amount of time, dealing with employee distress, conflicts. All of the things that are considered soft skills are actually costing huge amounts of money. So if there's not structures in place, right, not to mention lawsuits and claims by former employees, and of course the biggest cost, which is turnover, right? The average departure from any employee is somewhere between, depending on the company size and the industry, somewhere between 30 and 80% of their salary, right? And then if it's a higher level, officers and executives, it starts to get into the 150 and sometimes 200, 300% of the salary. But even for normal rank and file employees, we're talking on average 30 to 50% when you talk about all the various costs that come into replacing that one individual. That is incredibly expensive. And the number one contributor to employees leaving is a dissatisfied work environment, and in particular, a dissatisfied work environment from the person they report to, right? As they say, people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. So just when you start to look at the objective data, it's just indisputable that if a company invests money in a comprehensive well-being program that takes care of the emotions, the happiness, the engagement, the fulfillment of their employees, they're going to get a huge ROI on that investment. And there are some studies that show that there's something around, depending on the study, around 3 to 4 times, very tangibly provable, 3 to 4 times the return on the investment. So for every dollar that a company spends on well-being, they usually get around $3 or $4 in return. So I think it's based on just an archaic model that most companies function in. It's been kind of long-standing throughout, companies in the history of the world, which is there's a assumption, a false limiting belief that in order to maximize profits, companies need to run employees into the ground, chew them up, spit them out, bring in the next group, and that's the way to maximize profits. Now, before there was scientific data and sophisticated studies that existed in modern science, why not believe the myth? And that was a myth that was believed for decades and decades. But now we actually, very recently, just as of the last decade or so, we really have tangible, conclusive data showing that investing in employee well-being is actually one of the most sophisticated financial decisions a company can make. So what I like to do is lead from the place of financial strength. You're not going to get a company to change their policies or invest just from a perspective of trying to take care of their employees. That would be wonderful. Maybe 1% of companies might do that. But the vast majority of companies, look, they're not charitable organizations. They are for-profit organizations. They have a right to try to maximize profits. Many of them, if they're public, have shareholders or private shareholders. If they're not public, they have if not a right, they have sometimes a duty to maximize profits. The question is, can you understand, and here's why, that this will maximize profits? So that's first and foremost. If you can lead from a place of increasing financial strength, then what flows from that is greater emotional well-being, psychological well-being, people being cared for, honored, and everybody's happiness increases. But the truth is, that's the thing that most matters to me and so many others. But if we lead with that, that's going to fail. We just need to, as a first step, get companies to understand the math, the science of it. And when they understand that, they're much more likely to first become committed to it. So that's the first step. And then the second step is understanding the difference between individual versus structural changes. Individual changes are wonderful. Bringing in someone like me who does trainings, well-being trainings, resiliency trainings, mindfulness trainings, interpersonal communication trainings, leadership trainings designed to actually facilitate greater emotional well-being, engagement, loyalty by employees who report to those leaders. All that stuff is wonderful. But if we want to have the largest amount of effect, we have to start looking at the existing structures, right? Going up to the structures about how these kind of deeply ingrained structures are perpetuating high stress environments that are causing decreased well-being and decreased cognitive functioning and large financial losses. But I think that's the three-step approach is for most companies. One is you got to get real clear buy-in so that they understand this is not a charitable act. This is a financially prudent act. Two, start usually with the individual level and start providing programming and support to individuals who are in need to help them navigate the high stress environment. And then three, as that starts to build momentum, start to look at structural norms that can really lead to larger change. So that's my general view. And it all turns on them understanding first and foremost, this is how you make more money.
Yeah, sounds like music to my ears. Actually, a lot of companies run transformation programs to drive change, but soon they find themselves trapped in the same mundane approach to how they handle people. At the end of the day, transforming the energy in an organization requires a lot of cognition and workshops. In context of what you have shared, I cannot but think of asking you about how you think the workplace diversity impacts the company's culture. And do you believe in terms of inclusion that the employer has a duty to accommodate, and how far can they go?
Yeah, I think diversity and inclusion, belonging are critical to not only individual well-being of employees, but also then the entire functioning of teams in the organization. When it comes to functioning, again, this is another example you're bringing up where there's outdated, non-scientific beliefs that have persisted. They existed before the science, and then now that the science exists, those beliefs are still kind of rigid and hard to break, but the science is very clear that I think the biggest comment and response you hear from companies about diversity is, well, wait a minute. I don't want to just increase diversity at the cost of merit. We're a meritocracy. We don't want to expand diversity and sacrifice merit. And there's the false assumption. Diversity increases merit. Just logically speaking, not to mention all the science shows, if you have a greater pool and a more representative pool of individuals, this is just basic supply and demand, not to mention a huge amount of studies in D&I that actually prove this, but just simple, basic, low-level logic. You have a larger base to choose from, a more representative base, there's simply going to be a higher caliber of final individuals selected. So just the starting point from a logical perspective, that diversity could be in tension with merit as opposed to critical to merit is an interesting starting point. But then there's so many studies that show that as organizations, as teams have greater diversity of all sorts, racial, ethnic, sexual orientation diversity, ideological diversity, of course, gender diversity, the more diversity there is across all of the different realms, it actually advances the way organizations and teams actually interfunction, and then the decisions they make and how they perform financially. So it's one reason why many of the United States Supreme Court justices throughout history, right? These are people who are in a position to make the most important rulings that affect the United States constitutional structure and our policies across the entire country. So they're making the highest stakes decisions. It's very common for over 50 years for United States Supreme Court justices to have diversity of representation and among their ideology, especially, as well as other forms of diversity that's weaker. They're trying to improve that. But having different perspectives and having people from different backgrounds forces justices and other individuals who are making important decisions. We then start noticing our assumptions. We start noticing aspects of the way that we're functioning that actually might just be a result of habit and might not be the smartest and best way. But if we all have kind of a homogenous style of thinking or a homogenous background, which actually trained and wires our brain to think in a certain way, we're missing out on so many rich perspectives, wrinkles, alternatives. So again, I think the reason to do it is morality, ethics, because it matters that people feel included, that there's equality and belonging. That's the reason to do it. But if we can't get leaders to commit on that basis, it's very simple. Financially, all the studies show that having that diversity, and then beyond diversity, as you said, inclusion, a sense of belonging, actually significantly increases performance by employee teams and organizations. So I think it's a subset of well-being. I mean, one way of thinking of it is they're lateral, D&I and employee well-being, and that's a beautiful perspective. Another way of viewing it is, well, an aspect of all employee well-being is having a diverse and inclusive and belonging-centered workforce where people really feel they can be themselves, they're fully accepted and honored, that unconscious biases are not preventing their wisdom, their contributions from actually contributing to the well-being of the company financially. So I think it's very important. I think it's critical. I don't think you can have well-being in an organization where there is not an overt and powerful diversity, inclusion, and belonging function.
Interesting. So what are the practices you believe corporations should consider and the processes they need to follow to castrate interpersonal conflicts and destructive individuals? Basically the ones that are inflexible, vulnerable, difficult to talk to, irrational, or have limited and fragile coping mechanisms.
Right. And there are a lot of those, as we know, throughout every large organization. It's just and in many small organizations as well, but just statistically, if you're going to have a big organization, X percentage of them are going to, of those leaders are going to be toxic, or going to have maybe not toxic, and some of them are going to be just have emotional issues that really impair how people feel in showing up to work and reporting to them. So, well, one thing is companies are starting to become much more mindful about who they promote, right? I think one of the biggest problems is promotions have traditionally been based, and people being put into leadership positions based on their individual performance abilities, right? If you're a subject matter expert, for example, that usually when you are extremely good at your job, most companies say, okay, that person's now ready to be promoted. Then if they knock that out and they do that incredibly well and they're a true subject matter expert, they keep moving up. And with each move up, they're more likely to have greater responsibility over others. And at a certain point, they're actually in a tangible leadership role. But usually in most companies, unless they have a system in place, there's a very simple, long-standing system, the 9-box system that balances both individual performance with interpersonal, communication, and interpersonal with, the soft skills way of leading. And if there's not at least an equivalent balance, in fact, I argue that it actually should be leadership promotion decisions should be actually weighted significantly in favor of the emotional skills. Because again, all the data shows that that's what leads to greater performance in the company to make more money. But at the very least, a 50-50 weighting. But most companies suffer by overweighting or sometimes exclusively weighting individual performance. Okay, so you're great at fixing widgets. What does that have to do with inspiring individuals, with helping them move through their own challenges and problems, with dealing with employees who are underperforming but have a desire to get better, with overseeing two hard-headed individuals who both think they're right and they keep clashing heads on your team? It has nothing to do with it. So first, I think companies have to have a system in place where promotions are not based just on merit of individual performance, right? So having that structure that actually values all these other things is key. But then having, investing in those trainings. You can't blame people for not being good at navigating those very difficult aspects of life, emotions, communications. As leaders, it becomes really hard because you have huge amounts of individual responsibility to perform on your own, and you're suddenly having to manage everyone else's difficulties and emotions. And you can't really blame leaders for struggling with that. So many of them start to become reactive. They regress to antiquated communication styles using fear-based motivation, pessimism, a fixed mindset, castigation, and it destroys morale. But you can't really blame someone for doing something that they haven't been trained not to do. They've been rewarded their entire life. They've been educated based on subject matter expertise. They were hired based on subject matter expertise. They were promoted based on subject matter expertise. Well, it's our responsibility in the company then to start training them in very meaningful ways, not a single one-off workshop. Okay, you became a manager. Here, take this 1-hour workshop. Some sort of deeper leadership training is necessary, and a lot of companies don't effectively do that. But then once you have that, having accountability is key, right? Because people usually don't grow and change without some accountability, and having some objective tracking of accountability, like upward assessments, and then doing comparison, gathering data as a company on how individual employees perceive various bosses that they work for, how it affects their overall well-being, their desire to stay with the company, their performance, asking there's such valuable data we can get from employees that many companies ignore. And then once there's tangible data, like sitting down with a particular leader and saying, just so you know, here's the data we collected across our particular office, for example. And just so you know, you're in the bottom 5%. You're in the lowest 5% in terms of how employees rank your leadership skills, your emotional facilitation, how you respond to underperformance. So we want to better understand, because we're targeting the top, the bottom 15 or 20%, and you're actually in the bottom 5%. And it's an important aspect of your job that we slowly improve this. It's totally fine. Maybe you haven't gotten the training you've needed, and maybe you haven't had the experience, but our goal is to work with you over the coming 6 months, year, 2 years, and have material improvement. So just even that conversation, when there's objective data that literally shows over the course of an office or an organization or a region, this is where you stand. They may not like it. They may argue that the data is skewed for this or that reason, but it's very different because it gets people's attention. So it's using their unconscious bias, where most people who have risen high in companies are unduly attached to rankings, statistics, top 20%, bottom 20%. We need to use that to actually not to castigate them, not to shame them, but to open them up to the opportunity for growth. And then how we communicate that is obviously very important. But having accountability and then measuring that over time, having coaching support, right, for them. Having the support that actually has a back and forth of treating the interactions with their employees like a laboratory where they practice certain techniques, then they report back and share what their experience was like. I've seen it constantly where really challenging leaders who are very difficult to work for and undermine morale can actually make material change. Absolutely, it can be done, but we just have to give them the support. In fact, I used to be a real pain in the ass to work for early in my career when I was a lawyer, because I was indoctrinated by the leaders I worked for to work. This is how you treat people below you, and I was unconsciously doing that. And then I realized I don't have the relationships with my employees that I want, and I feel like I'm not getting the best performance out of them, even though I'm kind of cracking the whip a lot in all these different ways. Why am I not able to get them to perform the way I want them to perform? So I decided, wait, I have to look inside. I have to maybe change my style. That's when I started getting obsessed about leadership styles and communication styles. And I completely, over the course of a couple years, I started to make major changes. And then within 3 or 4 years, had a completely different, like revolutionarily different leadership style where, for the rest of my career, and now when I lead people as well, it happens regularly that people who are underperforming in other places or in other departments, when they work with me, all of a sudden their performance is significantly better. Well, it's not because I'm some sort of genius. I'm just applying science-based leadership techniques. We can all do that. We just have to learn how to do it. And it's the company's obligation to provide that training, that structure, and that accountability.
I can only have flashbacks and think of what you just mentioned now. There are many strains of workplace abuse, such as scapegoating and poor leadership. So how can you spot them, and what can you do about them? Many people are anxious about losing their jobs and might not be very comfortable sharing their experiences.
And are you talking about like individual, bad apples, or just the difficulties of working in a...
No, you see, seniors, executives running the show, many companies are actually causing distress. As you have rightly mentioned, some are handling leadership positions which are, they might not be equipped with the right tools or having the right experience to handle people. They're just managing a place. So again, I find it a bit tricky. People are afraid to speak. They might be burdened because of the workplace discrimination, harassment, and even gossip. So how can you spot these when you attend to a company?
Right. Good question. Well, one thing I think is really important is, like I said, that objective data in the form of surveys, but also having confidential e-box. Very few companies have confidential spaces where employees can report toxic behavior. And that's just that goes directly to HR leaders, that's actually monitored. That's a very important thing, because I think a lot of employees who are being subjected to it, their biggest fear is that if they speak up, they'll be retaliated against. So then having that confidential space that's actually reviewed, analyzed, and then there's teeth. It's the opportunity for the HR department to, if they're noticing trends. It's one thing if there's just one complaint of an individual over the course of 2 years, but if the same individual is getting, multiple complaints from different people, it's a theme. It needs to be, addressed, and it's in a safe space. Research even shows that employees, when there's confidential opportunities to disclose, they feel, even if their suggestions are not accepted, just the fact that the company is open to asking increases employee morale. But when an individual employee is dealing with those types of toxic personalities, those workplace abuses, and there's not an open space to express it, I think that becomes a real big problem. So I think that's key. Let's see what else can be done in this place. I had another thought that's an important piece, and it's leaving my brain right now. So maybe just give me a few seconds and see if it pops back.
It's okay. Obviously, in such a digitized environment, it's become inevitable to embrace young people working for companies. Here's a dilemma many companies are faced with, which is the notion that millennials are entitled but very hardworking. How do you think employers can create a proper balance in maintaining productivity and keeping everyone content? How can we build corporate cultures which are flexible at these transitioning times?
Yeah, it's hard. I agree with you. It's a dilemma because most people who are the leaders come from a very different mindset. And the things that some of these, millennials are viewing as proper or appropriate, those leaders would never have done in this situation, and it triggers them. Byron Katie is a teacher. She's named after her father, Byron, a woman who has taught about belief restructuring and the critical nature of learning how to accept and adapt to reality as is, and that the greatest amount of struggles, emotional, performative, it comes from resisting reality. And she gives the example that when you boil it down to it, many of our problems result from us looking at a dog and say, "Meow, doggy, I want you to meow." And we get very upset that the dog is barking instead of meowing. But the reality is, no matter how much we want a dog to meow, it's going to bark. It's not going to meow. And I don't mean to say that millennials don't like dogs. What I mean is we have to, I think as a corporate culture, we got to meet people where they're at, and personality and communication norms changed over the course of decades. Look at even the people who are leaders right now, or maybe top of the company. If you were to ask them how people communicated in the 30s, would they want that? Was that similar to how they communicated when they rose up? Of course not. They were the change agents back in the 60s and 70s. But, it's easy to be a change agent when you're younger and want people in power to act differently. But then when we get into power, people tend to think everyone below us doesn't get it and they're irresponsible. Well, frankly, every single generation for 200 years or probably forever has said this new generation doesn't get it and they're doing things the wrong way. So I would invite people who are frustrated with millennials to first understand this is not a new problem. This has been happening forever. And to accept that the dog is not going to start meowing no matter how much you want it to meow. This is a change, a cultural change, a communication change across the countries, across the globe, and no amount of corporate resistance is going to change that. But that doesn't mean you just let people kind of run willy-nilly, unbridled, and act disrespectfully. Or it's a matter of meeting people where they're at, and then also creating opportunities for them to also leverage those strengths and measure, kind of blend it with the old ways that have been proven to be really effective within the company. So just a simple example is millennials have been shown, and again, the science consistently shows it, all the anecdotal evidence shows it. If you just give a millennial an assignment without giving an explanation of the why, they will start either doing other things in addition to it or in place of it and think that they've done the assignment, but they actually haven't done the assignment. They will resist it. They will ask a bunch of annoying questions in response. They will question whether or not it's the right approach, right? Well, that's understandable from their mindset. Now, the person who's giving them the assignment might get enraged and think, what the hell are they doing? When someone gave me an assignment when I was a third year into the company, I did what my boss said. I shut up. I went to my office and I worked my butt off. I did it, and then I did it well. What the hell is all this discourse? Why are they pushing back? Why are they giving me ideas? I didn't ask for their ideas. I've been doing this 2 or 3 decades. I don't care what this person thinks. Now, that's what's going on inside the mind. But the reality is, it's a very simple solution. If people understand that they didn't require understanding the why or an explanation of how this relates to overall, client success, they didn't need that. Maybe we didn't need that and we could still do the job well, but millennials do. The data shows it. The science shows it, right? So any assignment should be, there's exceptions to everything, but any sort of major assignment shouldn't just be delivering of what to do. It should include a piece about the why, and including that, starting with the why. And Simon Sinek is a great teacher on this, obviously, and so many other teachers, but millennials more than anyone else, they need to start with the why. And a big mistake that a lot of leaders who are more senior make is they don't understand that simple concept. That's not, in my opinion, the fault of the millennials. The millennials are who they are. You can't be upset at a dog because it barks. The question is, the dog's been barking for this entire time. What can I as a leader do to maximize that person's performance? And that's one of many techniques, but there's simple techniques, but gotta let go of the idea that millennials need to fundamentally change. That's not going to work. It's just going to be crashing with reality. But then once you make those key accommodations to their cultural norms, all of a sudden then you can make specific asks because they're feeling honored, understood. You're getting their energy. They're getting kind of engaged in the project. They understand the why. They're much more likely to work hard. Now you can deliver after 2 or 3 assignments where they don't fully execute on the assignment as asked, and they add 2 or 3 pieces that were not asked. You sit down in a conscious way and say, I just want to share, I've noticed a pattern over the last 3 assignments. Sometimes you haven't delivered on the complete aspect of the assignment. Maybe you've done it 70 or 80%, but you've missed a key component, but then you've actually provided 3 new components that I didn't ask for. Let's talk about that because I'm interested in your process for that, and I'm not sure it's serving me. What I want to, then you kind of go through the process. Ask what made you think of those additional aspects, right? Because they love to think outside the box. You come through the back and forth conversation with an agreement that, listen, we will talk openly about that each time, but my request is to not give additional aspects of the assignment that you've added unless you've completed the entire core project. In fact, depending on the leader, some leaders might say, I don't want you to add that unless you specifically ask. If you have some idea outside the box or some new wrinkle, I want you to think about that. I want to keep your energy going, but just shoot me an email as you're working on the project. Hey, do you want me to think about these 2 or 3 layers that weren't part of the assignment? I'm happy to, right? Others might say you can just always add those additional layers, but make sure you do the first kind of core project completely. Probably for most leaders, I'd recommend the other aspect because it creates accountability for the millennial, which is it's important to me as a leader that you don't do work that I haven't asked you to do. It's not that I don't respect your creative thinking, your outside the box thinking, but if I'm giving you an assignment, it's important that you complete that fully and not allow your mind to kind of focus on other things that aren't asked, because that can actually deplete the quality of the work on the actual assignment. Then you show them how that happened. Can you reflect back what I just shared? Because I want to make sure you understand it, just because it's critical that we understand each other. So in your own words, do you mind explaining to me kind of how this experience occurred from my perspective as the leader? Then they have to explain it. If they don't understand it properly, no worries. You say, that's mostly correct. Here are a couple additions. Then have them reflect that back. Write this back and forth. And then the next time you give them an assignment, you say, remember what we talked about a week ago? This is a great chance to do it. You, with your creativity and your outside the box thinking, which is something we really value here, you're probably, as you're in the middle of the assignment, you're going to think of 2 or 3 things that weren't part of the assignment, and you're going to get energized by that. If that happens, I invite you to send me a quick email asking me if it's a good use of resources and time. In order for you to kind of jump on that, send it to me, but don't just do that without having a discourse on it. Then once we have the discourse, then we can go accordingly forward, right? So what that does is it doesn't suppress their ability to think of outside the box, but it does create accountability where they have to at least discuss it before making an inefficient detour, right? So I think that's like a balance of both honoring their desire to not be restricted, but also not letting them just run wild in a way that can be really inefficient and unnecessary. And that can actually lead to a lower quality performance on the core thing that they're being asked to do. So I think it's the responsibility of the leader to understand the mindset of the millennial and then intelligently, sophisticatedly adjust according to their mindset to maximize performance. That's what leaders need to do. And then, of course, companies need to support the leaders in knowing how to do that, because they don't wake up one day knowing how to do that. Why would they? So, and that goes back to our prior conversation.
Well, very interesting to hear. I hope this advice rings a bell with a lot of people, because I, can relate to it working with young people to jumpstart my own company. Finally, we all want to ensure fair and equal protection for all employees' rights. But in the absence of any employee right laws in some countries, How do you think someone can take care of themselves without having to compromise their careers or lose their jobs, or go through disputes and conflicts? What's your advice for these people working in such places?
That's a really, really tough one, right? Because it's like Maslow's, pyramid. It's like if you're in a country that doesn't have codified employee protections, or if those are regularly unenforced by the government or the legal system, employees are in this really difficult position of choosing between, putting food on the table for their family, survival, which is just a more urgent need, than emotional well-being, and that creates that major tension. As awful as it sounds, I don't recommend that any person be a martyr and then lose the thing that's more important for them, which is maybe their livelihood. That doesn't mean that I think that they should just kowtow to injustice. But I think that what is more likely to affect well-being in a company that's within a nation that doesn't have that type of protection for individual employee rights is the particular department they're in, the particular people they work with. And I think that even if there's a culture within the society at large that doesn't respect those things, individuals can take individual actions of self-care, but also communicating their needs and to the people they trust, to find an internal champion, right? And maybe to kind of gather a few people who are experiencing similar stuff and reach out. There's usually some people who are the more empathetic leaders within that system, right? And try to kind of spark some sort of larger movement through those individuals. But I think that if you come directly to the powers that be that enact those structures and come with too much of a demand, it can backfire, as opposed to taking the more gentle approach. It's something that even in more protective societies, like even in the US right now, that's the same issue that's happening with D&I, which is diversity and inclusion leaders. Most companies now, bigger companies at least, have, and finance companies, law firms, they have a diversity and inclusion officer. Well, that's the exact challenge they're experiencing, but at a much less extreme level. If they try to push the organization to make too much change, the organization will recoil and push back unconsciously against some of the more doable changes. So a lot of D&I officers constantly talk about meeting the company, meeting leaders where they're at, like being compassionate that they're far away from where we want them to be. And you can't try to stretch people too far too soon, even though where we're trying to stretch them to is the right thing. But just because it's the right thing doesn't mean it's the best thing to do right now, because it can lead to a whiplash where then it can actually decrease the baseline level of protections that are occurring right now. I think it's somewhat analogous, which is even though those rights for employees are absolutely fundamental and critical, and any just society would allow those, the question becomes, well, what is the smartest approach to achieve that in the long term? And if we push too hard too soon, there's more likely to be pushback, retaliation, and recoiling, and it can kind of subvert well-being actually in the short term and the long term. So I know that's a bit of an esoteric response, but I think it's kind of working in both meeting people where they're at and then trying to gently stretch them to the next level, step by step, is the best way that I could put it.
Couldn't agree more. The only thing which is not changing is change. Allow me to thank you. Wonderful to talk to you, and look forward to many insightful sessions in the nearest future.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me, and thank you for the awesome work you're doing and the passion you have for creating better, healthier, more just environment. It's wonderful, the work you're doing, my friend. Thank you.
See you, Jarrett.
Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this episode from Coast to Coast Podcast. For more resources and access to episodes which will help you find real marketing success, visit www.jacobinternationalgroup.com. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and stay connected on all our social media accounts.